Okay guys, so this lesson is called The Incredible 1880s. We're looking at immigrants and industry, and probably actually the best way to actually define this lesson and kind of what we're looking at here is we're looking at immigrants and industry really from an industrial perspective, okay? So in this lesson, what we're trying to achieve here is we're looking at the impact of industrialization on the U.S., and we're looking through management strategies and corporations, okay? So really, we are kind of in the era after the Civil War of big business, and we're going to kind of look at that from their point of view, okay? And then later in the lesson, you guys will look at the lives of these new immigrants who come, like basically the other half of the equation, all these new immigrants who come to the United States and how they play roles in not just these corporations, but then also in the rest of civic life. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to our mini lesson because that's what this video is going to focus on, okay? You guys will do the other activities, but we are going to look here, this mini lesson is really focused on the impact of these corporations and how industry and industrialization changes things, okay? So, we're going to look at techniques that corporations can utilize to increase efficiency, okay? And then we're also, a big kind of theme of this mini lesson is to how really the organization of work affects how people feel and how they do their jobs, like how they feel when they do their jobs. And any of you who have part-time jobs, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that sometimes things can feel very tedious and monotonous, or like you're just like another cog in the wheel, so to speak, that's easily replaceable. And we're going to kind of see why that starts to become a thing. All right? So, the context for this is that before we actually, I guess, get into it, we need to make sure we back up, and you need to make sure you remember that the first industrial revolution that we talked about last semester had a really, really big influence in really just kind of getting the United States not only connected, but then also industrialized, and in terms of like really getting the trains, literally speaking, going. Okay, so the first industrial revolution was something we called state-sponsored capitalism, okay, and it's powered by three things: coal, steam, and railroads. That was the first industrial revolution, and again, we covered that last semester. Okay, so those three things: state-sponsored capitalism, also known as mercantilism, powered by coal, steam, and railroads. Then we had the second industrial revolution. Okay, and that's really what this lesson is going to look at. And this is a new kind of industrial revolution. It's going to focus on corporate capitalism. Okay, and we'll talk about what that means. And it is powered by three new things: oil, steel, and electricity. Okay, one big thing to remember here is that the second industrial revolution would not have been possible without state-sponsored capitalism as well. Okay, and so that's going to be continuing here, but we really are going to enter like a new era on top of that, which is corporations. Okay, and also this is definitely going to include a massive number of immigrants. All right, so what is corporate capitalism? Well, in this new age of basically of the Civil War, when businesses are changing, it's the idea that most economic and therefore political power gets held by corporations. Okay, or is wielded by them, especially kind of in the offensive sense. And if you don't know what a corporation is, it's a large business, okay? But what these essentially corporations do is they hold a tremendous amount of power, and they grow really, 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 really strong after the Civil War. Some even become known as trusts, which they're just big, gigantic groups of corporations that have even more power. So this is, for example, Andrew Carnegie of U.S. Steel, J.D. Rockefeller of the Standard Oil Company, and then J.P. Morgan Chase, who to this very day, I guess would be the very, very late owner of Chase Bank that we've all maybe driven past before. Okay, so I'd like you to consider, what's a corporation you interact with on a daily basis. I'll give you one. Probably gas is probably one. The buying from Speedway or Shell. Those are gigantic. Well, Shell especially, BP is an example of a corporation. So come up with your own. Okay, and when you're ready, you can move on. Now, okay, really what we are then looking at here is how, again, to go back and review our objective, just to make sure we're solid on that, we're looking at explain the impact of industrialization through management strategies and corporations, right? So the question then is, how does industrialization change things? And that is because corporations, but not just them, but also businesses as well, really do try to increase their efficiency. And especially there's a whole bunch of techniques that do this. Okay, so the first is called vertical integration. Okay, now vertical integration basically means that you control all parts of production from a raw material, like getting it out of the ground, to the creation of a finished product. Okay, now vertical integration today is actually not very common. There's a few organizations that do it. I'll just give you here a made-up example. Okay, so let's say that I would own a business making Apple iPhones. Okay, now if Apple were to go and be vertically integrated, that means that there would be Apple workers who would dig the product out of the ground. There would be Apple trucks that would then transport that to be melted down at Apple factories, which would then build the products. And you would have Apple engineers, Apple salespeople, Apple truck drivers. And see, so this is why we don't really have this very commonly today, is that because basically it requires you being good at too many things, okay, and we call that vertical integration. Now, horizontal integration is actually much more common today, and that's basically where you buy out all of your competition who does the exact same thing as you, okay? So instead of trying to be good at everything, which is vertical integration, you try to be good at one thing, and you try to drive everybody else out of business, okay? For instance, if we were to take the Apple example, Apple really, I guess if we talk about phones, really just does focus on making quality phones and competing against companies like Samsung or Google. Okay, so that would be an example of that. Okay, so what we're looking at here, okay, and then I'll kind of talk about this last one here before I get to that point. Predatory pricing. Okay, so this is one more technique. Basically, you cut prices so low that it drives out your competition, and you can survive the temporary drop. Okay, so this is what we also could call like the Walmart effect, that Walmart can sell things so much more cheaply than other stores that are around them. And even if Walmart, for example, let's say they sold it at 50% of the price that they normally would, which you would think, right, would hurt their business. In this case, they can survive, because they're a large organization, they could survive going on an even lower price for a while, and that drive down to the bottom would get rid of all their competition. Okay, we call that predatory pricing. Now, those three things that we described, those are all techniques to not only improve efficiency, but also to create what we call monopolies. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So, other techniques. We start to see things like pushers, which are foremen who encourage workers to be faster. Encourage, hint, hint. We start also to see child labor, okay, done by both families and corporations. Families want the money. Corporations want kids who can work in small confined areas. They can pay them less. Okay. We also start to see other things, and you guys did some of that earlier. And we see stuff like the assembly line. We also see what's called subdivided work, and if you basically those two things go hand in hand. And it's you do one task and you just repeat that all day long. One of the more unique and kind of, I think, a really good example of this kind of like drive for efficiency and monopolies during this time is something called stopwatch management. We truthfully should probably call this Taylorism. It's named after a guy whose last name was Taylor, and he basically went around the United States preaching all of these super efficient methods that he came up with. And he was kind of a fraudulent kind of guy. But the idea that you manage workers, like you have to produce this many products in this much time, or your salary gets cut. That kind of idea where you're pushing people to their limits to do one task and do it as fast as possible in the most efficient way, we call that Taylorism, okay? Stopwatch management. Okay. Now the question is then, how does that make workers feel? What's the impact of this? Well, as you guys saw in your activity earlier, the work that you do when you put it on an assembly line, at first you were just creating that product like on your own. It was just like, it was your baby. Like you took it from its very beginning to the very end. That was a high skill job. Now everything is low skill because you're literally doing the same repetitive, meaningless very simple rote activity again, and you do become another cog in the machine that can be replaced. Okay, so for example, workers would try to never be sick because they knew that if they were sick, their job wouldn't be there the next day. Okay, it also, we start to see, creates barriers between blue collar on the floor, okay, meaning they're working with their hands, and white collar, which are professional kind of management jobs. Okay, and so there starts to become a tension there, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more next class. And we'll see how that will eventually result in what we call labor organizations, okay, or organized labor. But it does result in better lives. And so we start to see a couple of things. Number one, we start to see like some of the first actual like national consumer culture. And so we see things like the invention of the salesman and the saleswoman start to become a thing. We see secretaries, the first secretaries start to come around. Department stores. Okay, if you've heard of Sears and how they've been going out of business recently, this is where we actually start to see Sears catalogs and the idea that you could order something from somewhere else and it would show up on your door. And we start to see some very consumer-focused advertisements. And my favorite one is right over here that says, "Ladies, don't argue with a burglar." It says, "Show him a revolver." And there's some pretty awesome writing here, which I'll read. "Ladies can handle the new Johnson Safety Hammerless Automatic Revolver with absolute safety. Accidental discharge is impossible. Children cannot discharge them." So the idea here that we're having people appeal to this like brand, as funny as that seems, like the idea that people are now appealing to a national audience is really a unique development. Besides the idea that you think that guns, can't accidentally, discharge, which is kind of funny. Okay, so from this point, you're going to go ahead and carry on with the rest of the lesson. You're going to be looking at the lives of immigrants and their new roles in the nation. Okay, and you're going to see here we have two groups: South and Eastern Europeans, which are mostly Germans, Italians, Polish, and Russians. Okay, not so much the Irish anymore. Okay, and then also Chinese Americans on the West Coast. And you're going to see kind of what these people's experiences were, and you're going to kind of explain what their roles were. And from that point, I'm going to leave you guys to it.